So,
So one of the things that I want to talk about is how we need to really listen to our students, how we need to value their voices. I think many times we sort of listen to students, but not necessarily. We say, oh, yes, that's good. That's a nice idea. It's all my, but they don't really know if they've been heard. So that's really my focus today. And so I want to value your voices also. So, please feel free to jump in. And I think that's going to be really important. Now, one of the things, it's not just students who have to discover. I love this quote. The art of teaching is the art of assisting discovery. It's like you're trying to get your students to discover things, not necessarily to tell them all that. And I'm thinking of your comment earlier, Diana, how, they have to discover so much, whether it's language or whether it's content. But we need to discover and promote students' voices to be successful. It's not just students who have to discover things. Our students can help us discover. Now, for learning to take place, students need to feel that they are being understood and given the opportunity to speak out, to really speak, right? Sometimes you just say, oh, what did you do over the weekend? And the students will say, oh, I went to a party. And you say, oh, that's nice. But, that's not really finding out what your students think. Now, one of the most sincere forms of respect is actually listening to what another has to say. But do we really listen? Students know when teachers are really listening to them and when they're really interested in their responses and ideas. But sometimes we as teachers, and I can include myself, we're so busy, I got to get my content, I've got to follow this, that we're really not listening to what our students are saying. And active listening builds respect and sends a message that students are important in the learning process. Too often, the students just think, okay, maybe they're not that important. And maybe this just the content's important or the teacher's important. And I'm not saying content's not important and language is not important, but students are important too. So when you take the time to really listen to them, and don't be so quick to necessarily jump in. Many times when I ask a student a question, they don't respond immediately, so I jump right in. But sometimes you need time to stop and think. So I think giving time to stop and think is really important in terms of the listening process. Now, one of the first things that I start with is how do I feel? And I actually do this many times, maybe even in the first class when I meet someone. And we need to find out how students feel. We've all been students. And how would you complete the following statements? And I'm just going to be jumping in. Robert and Diana, and now we have a few more who have joined us. Oh, you have to admit someone. Some people need to be admitted, Gary. I don't know. Okay. Think back when you were a student, Robert, right? As a student, you feel you belong when? How might you complete that sentence?
when they recognize my acknowledgement and presence.
Okay. Then how do you think students know that you recognize their presence?
Well, you have to have proper body language and tone of voice. That can be very important. Your body language and your tone of voice, your eye contact, your body position. Have you ever done research about that?
Yeah, but yeah, the aspect is like students know, I want to know, and I have them fill out this, right? As a student, I feel I belong when. And I thought I would get just I did this in my class this semester, and I mean, I got 50 different responses. They kept going on and on. So I think that's really important. Diana, how might you, if you were a student, right? And we've all been students, how do you feel when you belong?
Well, I've always had a feeling of belonging in a classroom, but I empathize with my students. I let them know that I'm personally interested in them. If I say, how do you feel? I expound upon it. I want to know, how their day went, what was nice in their day, what communication they had with their families, etc. I try to go beyond just a simple how do you feel, and try to really learn about them.
Another way of doing it is to say, I feel I belong when the other students know who I am and care.
And I find it very insightful when I do in the very beginning. I said, and this is another question I have. As a student, I'm just doing a range of questions. As a student, I feel valued when, and I think some of the similar answers, I'm sorry, Connie, right?
Yes.
Okay. I think your answers are the first one. So, I mean, I don't ask too many questions, but this is another one. Somebody is, Gary, I guess I have to add admit. Oh, Alex. Okay. As a student, Robert, you feel competent when? When do you feel competent?
When they acknowledge my interactions or something to say in a worthwhile way.
Yeah, I mean, so students want to know, they want you to communicate with them, right? I feel competent. It could be in terms of instructions or feedback or how you value. So I actually do something like this in the beginning because I want the students, especially when you're working with adults, because adults come with experience, right? Which is my next point. It's not doing it. Enter. It's not going. I need my next, something is happening to my,
Give it a second. I think it's just your system.
it's just my system.
Yeah,
Oh, no.
it's not from
Okay,
mine.
fine. Okay, the one thing that I think is really important for us is that adults bring experience, right? They may be learning new skills, but they are not inexperienced. And adult learners tend to filter their learning experience through their past and present experience. Even if you're teaching beginners who are beginner language learners, right? They have experience. And too often what I observe is that some of the material treat them like they're kids, right? But they have experience. They've learned to think. They've learned to do things in their first language. So I think that's a really important. So we need to find out and think about their experience. Now, one of the things I think is really important is, what do you think your students need to learn? We come at it as a teacher. What do you think your students need to learn? But we also have to think about, what do your students think they need to learn? And, that's not always a match, right? And then that creates sometimes dissonance. So I take time to find out, what do you need to learn? And sometimes we can be surprised what they come up with, right? And so one of the things that I do when I'm teaching, I go back into like a counseling language learning approach. I'll say, okay, what do you want to be able to say? What do you want to be able to read? And so sometimes I create situations like that because I know what I think they need to learn. And it might be very valuable, but it may not necessarily be what the students think they need to learn. So we need to find out what they need to be able to do. And, you know, we're living in a fast-paced, changing world today. So I don't know. I don't have the same experiences of my students, right? So I think that's a really important part. That's of listening. Now, Diane, are you still here?
Yeah, I'm listening.
Okay, because it's not coming across the chat. Do you find there's a difference between what you think they need to learn and what your students think they need to learn?
Well, I think it's important to find, I always ask them to bring in subjects and not materials, to tell me what they need. If they need to work on different aspects of like employment, finding an apartment, all different topics. What do you need? Do you need conversation? Do you need reading? Do you need writing? And I try to incorporate all of that. One thing I do is, which has been very successful, is I do this is my life for each student, and give them a half hour to bring in a detailed history of their life in their country, their decision to come to this country, their experiences in coming, and since they're here. And they bring in pictures, they bring in all different things. And it becomes almost an emotional catharsis for a lot of them. But they feel really bonded with each other after those presentations. So every class I have 1 or 2 students do that until they've all done that. And there's a real bond created between them.
You know, and I
And
think
sometimes I have to
I'm
say,
sorry.
sometimes, Connie,
I'm
sometimes
sorry.
when I ask my students what it is that they need, and a lot of times they say it's need help with their children, so their children are successful in school. And that's a very interesting concept, because it's not only their life, but it's their child's life.
And I'll give you, that's a really, I like the idea of bonding, because I think that's really important. But one of the times I was teaching a class, and I asked some students, what did they need? They needed to be able to talk to their children's teachers.
Yes.
What do I say, right? And I had
Yes.
never thought that that would be so important to them. Like, what do you say to the teacher? And I think that's really important because they came from a culture where there was a separation of, you know, school and family. And, you know, the American school system is like, parent involvement is really important, and they wanted to become involved. And I didn't realize that was a specific need. You know, that was outside, you know, didn't really fit into my curriculum. I was able to do it. And the fact that I want to bring up Diana's point, where it's at the actual bonding. When students share their voices, they can connect with each other and they can understand each other. How many times I've been, not lately, in a class where at the end of the semester, nobody knows anybody, right? Maybe not in our classes, but I've been in class where I don't know anything about anybody else in class, right? Because we haven't given students a time to share. And so I wanted to, you know, tap in to what you were saying, Diana, because I think when we bond with each other in a class, you know, the class goes better. So thanks.
And the thing about ESL students is that most of them have a lot of experiences that are very similar from their original native countries and their journey to the United States. They share a lot of similar experiences. And when they see that other people have those experiences as well, you know, and then they can open up more in the classroom. They can open up, they can support each other more in their learning. I think it's you know, a pretty valuable tool.
So that's really my point. It's like they're not alone, right? They're part of a group. And that's why we have to take a time. Now, the next part is I'm doing different aspects. But I want to use this is that oftentimes what I know, all right, what I know, right? My students don't know, right? But often we don't think about what my students know and I don't know. And too often in our classes, we are operating from what I call the hidden. It's hidden, right? It's like what I know, but you don't know. Or it could be blind, what I don't know, but you know. So that's why I think we have to stop and listen to our students. And I'm going to be making my slides available, and I'm hoping that some of you, we can keep this dialogue going, because now, how do students know, we've been talking about, how do students know they've been heard? Now, oftentimes, in some of your classes, you've talked about a learning style, and yeah, sometimes you give a learning style survey, but I'm talking about what is your communication style and what are the styles of your students? Because sometimes I've had, and I think all of us have experience, I have to change my communication style because it doesn't necessarily match the communication style of my students, right? So one of the things that I do is the internet has a number of sites. Our students like and use technology. In fact, some of them are much better at technology than we are, right? And I think we demonstrated this today when I was having problems, with my technology. So this is just one site. And so here's an example. On each line, pick one of these that's most like you. You like to analyze, you like to interact, you like to decide, or you like to explore. Just pick the one that's most like you, or is most descriptive of you. And do it for number 2 also. You tend to be objective, emotional, practical, visionary. Now, of course, I might change some of these words depending on the language level of my students, because they might not know visionary, right? But just for our sake, right? So Connie, for number 1, which one would you pick?
1, like to analyze.
You like to analyze. Robert?
I like to interact and analyze, like one of those two.
Okay. Diana?
I like to interact and I like to explore.
Okay, so that would be, some students are going to have both, right? How about Connie, how about number, I don't know who else is in our workshop. We have 9 people, but okay. Connie, who else is in our workshop? Because I'm not seeing people. Okay, so Connie, are you tend to be objective, emotional, practical, or visionary?
Practical.
Practical. Diana?
Visionary.
Visionary. Robert?
Practical and objective.
Okay, so, there are a number of communication styles like this. This is not your learning style. When you're communicating, you have a style, right? And so oftentimes that's, hi, Gary, Gary, I guess, were you here for number 1? What would you have picked? Like to analyze, like
Oh,
to
like to analyze.
analyze. How about number
Yeah.
2?
Objective.
Objective. And we're not necessarily going to go through all of these, but when you go in terms of, for instance, like a thinker, a thinker likes to analyze, right? A feeler likes to relate to and understand experiences. And sometimes you'll come up with a sensor, or sometimes it's an intuitor. And, I actually take the survey myself. It's like, what is my communication style? And it can change depending on the task. Now, sometimes you'll have different things. Sometimes it'll be thinker, feeler, sensor, intuitor, but there are other styles. Sometimes it's passive, aggressive. So you have different categories, and you can decide which of the ones that you want to use. And sometimes they talk about the relator, the socializer, the thinker, the director. And I think you have to pick it, select it in terms of it's easier for you to explain to your students. Now, one of the issues is I'm sorry, Diana, were you going to say something, or Connie?
No.
Okay.
not good.
Okay. We need to anticipate how students with different styles may react to classmates who have different styles. Because even when we did this informal survey right now, we all came, and it's a small group, we came up with different styles, and we're all interacting in the classroom. And so we need, as teachers, to know how to handle these different styles.
Well, Mary, you know about that Myers-Briggs
Yeah,
test, right?
right.
So it's
but,
not a
you know,
coincidence that it's 4, right?
Right, but probably I wouldn't use that necessarily with my students, right? Unless they were really, really advanced, right? But for the purpose of this workshop, since we're going to be working on different things, we're only going to focus on 2 of the communication styles, right? So if your student, and when you go through if your student is a feeler, right? One of the strengths is they're good at building rapport, communicating tactfully, because they're understanding others. They can come across as very friendly and aware of the uniqueness of others. But others who don't have that style might perceive them as they overly personalize situations, right? We're not here to hear all about your experience, or they may overlook important details, and they might be more concerned with the process of the interaction than with the content of the task. So it's not that feeling is not a good trait, but how others may be perceiving it, right? And so you have to be able to deal with that. Now, how can a teacher motivate and support feelers, knowing what their style is? How do you reinforce that so that they know it's a good style? Any ideas? How would you motivate, somebody who comes out and on my little thing as a feeler? What do they need? Hi, Valentina. Hi, go ahead, Valentina, your hand's up, but you're muted.
You're muted.
Valentina? Oh, she's muted, but her hand's up. Okay.
I'm trying to get her
Okay.
out.
So, Robert, say you recognize a feeler in your class, right? However, or you want, how would you reinforce that style? Thinking, okay, it's a good style.
No, I say, how are you? So do you have something to share for us? And also use social emotional learning with empathy, self-awareness, responsible decision-making, social interaction, and self-management. 5 components of the social emotional learning to effectively interact with those feeler type people.
And respond, I'll say, oh, I like how you helped Tony finish his statement, or something like that. In other words, because they're really good. But how might students who have a low feeler score be supported?
I think and what I do is I group students together, and I understand how they react to each other, and I put them together, and they become a group, and it's the group answer, not a singular person's answer.
Right, because being able to interact with each other, being involved in the process is really important. So, because even in our small group, we had different styles already, right? And so you want to make sure everybody can deal with different styles, right? It's not just my style that's important. Now,
And I think what it
I'm
was
sorry,
also
go ahead.
I think what's also interesting is if you put people together who have different styles, so they can come up with a conclusion with the three of them together.
Because sometimes if you want it to be a really productive activity, that's a really
Yes.
good idea, right? So I think that's important. Now a thinker, because somebody came up with thinker, they really like accuracy, they like preciseness, they're able to problem solve, they're good at analyzing information, they're very logical, right? But others might perceive them as being overly cautious. They might not necessarily know how to apply the information. They might even miss the big idea. And they might not want to take risk. I'm just bringing up some of the things, right? So, because all right, so this is a good style, but they need to develop other aspects. Now, I'm going back to my initial question is, how can a teacher motivate and support thinkers? Any ideas there? How might, Valentina, I know you had your hands up, but you're still muted.
I don't think she's there.
Oh, okay. Whatever.
Going
Okay,
to
stay.
outer space.
Right. Okay. So how can a teacher motivate and support thinkers? Connie?
Well, if you have a thinker who wants to draw a natural conclusion about things, you give them
I'm sorry,
something-
Valentina.
You give them
I'm
something.
sorry, Connie.
You can't hear me?
Yeah.
No, no, no. It was Valentina. She is there, it seems.
We'll wait
Okay,
until
let her
Connie
speak then.
finishes.
Sorry, Connie. Keep going, hon.
Me or Valentina?
No, Connie.
Okay, so when you have a person who's a thinker and they have to draw a logical conclusion to something, you give them something, a story, an inference or whatever, and you say, what do you think the outcome would be?
Right.
And you
And
let
so-
them utilize their abilities to do it. And sometimes what I do with my students, if they're having problems with their children at school or whatever, I say to them, what's the issue and what do you think the best way to resolve this is? And they'd come up, like, talk to the teacher, whatever. And I say, okay, do it.
And I want to backtrack to something, I think it was Diana said, or maybe it was you, Connie. How sometimes you put people who have the same style together, and that can really work. Okay. But
That's what I do.
sometimes I deliberately put people with different styles.
Yeah.
So
that's it.
then we come up with even a more creative and innovative answer. So knowing the styles of your students helps you, sometimes I put them together and sometimes I want different style. So I really do take time in the beginning and I adapt it differently, right? And I don't have one good communication style survey, but you can even create your own. And it doesn't have to be long, but I think taking time to find that out is really important.
Can I
and-
share something with you? When my students first
Is
come,
this Valentina or is this Connie?
Connie. When
Okay,
my
sorry,
students
Connie.
when my students first come to class, the thing I ask them is the three things that they feel are important in their life. That they want answers to or they want to understand. And each of them writes the three things and they hand it to me with their name on it. And that's it. And then I review it, I look at it and I think, okay, this is what we need to do here.
Right. So that's why what I'm saying, that's like when you value their input, it informs our teaching, and we can become better teachers because we're, especially for adults, we're meeting the needs of our students.
Yes,
No.
that's right.
One of the things is that many of you we talk about learning styles, right? And that's sometimes covered in training. Do you have an auditory style? Do you have a visual style, right? Because I think that sometimes, now, one of the problems is that there are many learning style surveys. And one of the challenges with questionnaires and surveys is that they're time consuming, right? So, I have to get on with the task. They're time consuming. And students sometimes just mark things randomly. Okay, check, 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 right? And then they have to go and score them. That doesn't really give me the information I necessarily need. So I think the information can be valuable, but the process can become cumbersome. And, students remember the slide that I said, what do the students think they need to know? So if they have to take these long surveys, they're saying, this is not what I came to learn, right? So what I usually do is I want their opinions, right? Just checking things off. Okay, I tend to learn by listening to the teacher. But I want them to stop and think, right? So this is one suggestion I have. I sometimes just ask 6 questions, right? Because with the learning style, you have auditory, visual, tactile, kinesthetic, individual, and group, right? So I ask them, and it's, adults come and they have opinion. Sometimes little kids have opinion, but, adults have that experience. They have opinion. They know what they think, right? So I might say, when I read instructions, I remember them better, right? So do you strongly agree, undecided, disagree? And that would be testing, when I read directions, I remember them better. So that would be more of a visual style, right? I don't need 30 statements. Or I remember things I have heard in class better than things I read. So, honey, how would you answer number 1?
Say again.
How would you answer question 1? When I read instructions, I remember them better. Do you agree with that statement or not?
Sometimes.
So maybe yours is undecided, right?
Well, it depends on what the instructions are. If they're technical instructions, I have to go back and read it a few times. If it's just an instruction on how to do something, basically, simply, I don't have to read it again. So it's determined upon whether it's mathematically and technically, or whether it's just something that's telling you what to do, like, put the pot on the stove, before you cook it or whatever. You know what I mean?
So, Connie, you're doing exactly what I want my students to do, right? I don't want them just to select one. I want them to, maybe they have different situations. So I really want to know why, give me examples. I learn from that just by having students circle it. And I always say, why? And so, Connie, you really illustrated, it depends on the situation. And then they're going to share information with you. Now, Robert, I remember things I have heard in class better than things I have read. What would your answer be to that?
Well, depends. Like, if you have strong background knowledge, I can remember what the heck I learned. If I don't have strong content background knowledge with things that I'm not familiar with, I ain't gonna remember a heck of a lot. Sorry about the bad grammar.
No, that's fine. But you're also illustrating. So take time, as however the statements you have, get your students to talk about it. You're getting an insight from that, and that would be really important. Now the next one is, I learn better when I make drawings as I study. Diana, how would you answer that one? I learn better when I make drawings as I study.
Drawings of anything or drawings of?
Yeah, or sometimes, doodles or
Doodle.
whatever, right?
Um, I don't think so. I like to focus on what I'm studying. So
Okay,
I like to stay focused.
stay focused. But others people might say, I stay focused when I do doodles or I draw diagrams, you see?
Mhm.
Graphic organizers.
Graphic
Graphic
organized.
organized to reduce working memory deficit issues.
Yeah. And Gary, how about I prefer to learn by doing something in class?
Strongly agree.
Strongly agree, right? And why?
I think it just reinforces the thinking process, right?
Okay.
Using your
And-
body.
Right. And you see, again, I always ask why to my students. I don't just have them, identify something. And I find I learn a lot from that. Like I learn best when I study with others. I don't know who else is here. Diana, can you answer that one? I learn best when I study with others.
No, I like to study on my own. I
Okay.
like to concentrate on my own.
And I might say to your student, why?
And it depends on what type of course it is.
Actually, I have to say this, there's like two opposites that I learn best when I study by myself and then when I discuss it with others.
See?
And
you
I
know,
also would add to it, it
So
depends.
you come in with what you think, and then the other people come in with what they think, and then you make a decision what you think is really true.
and
it
see,
depends on the type of course. If you're studying a performing arts type of course, then it's best to study with others that are more experienced and that can offer something to what you're doing. If it's something that can be learned from a book, I like to do it on my own.
right. And a lot of my students, when I give them this one statement, I learn better when I study with others. Most of them disagree. Most of them disagree, right? And I can almost predict that because some of them have never had to study with others before. So they don't know necessarily the value of working with others, right? And so I have to sometimes, I have to create situations where, oh yeah, it was good to work with each other. Or, Connie's point about like, I come prepared and now I can share with others. But I think getting students to think about this, and because I want them to stop and think also, right? It's like, well, what do I really feel? And why do I feel that way? So giving a learning style survey, sometimes they have 30 statements and then they ask the students, to rate them. I don't think that is as helpful. And getting students to actually share why. And don't forget, you're working sometimes with students that come from different cultures, right? And I think that's a really important thing because they may come from, if they've gone to school before they get here, right? Maybe their classroom culture, you don't necessarily work with others. So they don't have that experience. So remember how we talked about earlier, the experience is really important. Now, take time to observe the communication style of your students when they are interacting in group assignments. So now, one of the things we need to think about is understanding the diversity and inclusion. So if you're, in fact, working on, we talk about social justice a lot today, right? And sometimes we give activities where the students they don't have that experience to interact, right? And so try to have activities that would include everybody. Now, one of the things, example I gave with my students, and I don't have the illustration, but I gave them a series of pictures, right? And I said, well, which picture would you think you could talk about the most? And there were different, I got them from Google Images. And they picked certain pictures, right? And which one wouldn't you be able to talk a lot about or interested in talking about? And I deliberately picked one that was a really great visual, but you couldn't really say anything about it. It was a beautiful butterfly, right? And but you couldn't say very much. It's like, this is a butterfly. It's colorful. The student said, I like butterflies, and that's all they could say. So they said, well, I couldn't really say that much, right? And but one of the students who was from the DR, oh, no problem. They had this whole experience because the butterfly symbolism is really important in the DR, and the person went on and on and on. So, we need to listen to our students, because I would have thought, okay, that wasn't a good visual to use. So that's really important. And it needs to be, it's really hard because we have a whole lot of mandates to have social justice today, but do they really create experiences where everybody can participate? And I think that's one of the challenges today. And I'm just curious, because I want to reach out to some of you. How do you address social justice today, because we're not being bombarded. I don't like that term, but we're being challenged. What are some of the things, Diana, that so all the students feel like they could participate?
Well, first of all, I do not see people as different based upon the color of their skin or their religion or anything else. So I see a person. I really mean that. I see a person. I don't see differences. And I think this emphasis on differences is in itself segregationist. I believe that people are people, one people. So when I don't think about my students in terms of color, or they have a different religion, I'm respectful of everyone. And I really want to instill learning in them wherever they come from, whatever they believe. So for me, this whole idea of inclusion, it's to treat people as one people. That's how I feel.
And
I have to agree with you on that. When I look at my students, no matter where they come from, we're just all the same. And what is our goal? Is our goal to have a good life, get our children educated, have a job. You're so right. I agree with you 100%.
Well, we're all human beings, aren't we?
How about culturally responsive teaching and social emotional learning, Mary Carpenter?
Well, I'm going to get to that, Robert, but I actually agree, with what Diana and Connie are saying, because, I don't do that either, but actually I'm trying to focus on the activities that we use, right? So in other words, if I'm talking about a certain activity, I want it to be something that everybody can talk about. So in a way,
I'm gonna share with you something. When I was teaching,
oh, I wish you would. Go ahead.
When I was teaching ESL students from other countries, right? And I was in the South Bronx, and I decided to take them over to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and whatever. And I did those things. That's what we did. And we're walking down the streets, and they were saying, "Oh, I can't live here. I can't do this." And I looked at them and I said, "Neither can I." And that's what it's about. But just enjoy it, because I can't live here either.
Right. And so I actually wanted to bring this up because this is a really issue, in other words, but I I'm thinking about classroom activities or maybe a writing activity also. It's like, is it something that the students can really write about? I'm not saying that, because they have different experiences, right? And can they all fit in? Getting back to your point, Robert, continue.
Also, what about methodology such as sentence stems, model examples? What sentence stems? What is when there's no clear-cut answer? Like, what is your view? In my opinion, I think using sentence stems like a writing across the curriculum after you do a reading, or if you do a grammar activity when they make conversations, you give model conversations first, so those activities are doable.
Well, I think that that's another thing that I actually do, I think, right? Because people are allowed to think, right? Maybe I think differently than you do, right? It's not that I'm not disagreeing with you, Robert, but I think, right? So I think, the students need to feel free to say what they think, right? And too often, they want to know what's the right answer. What's the right
Especially
answer?
in East
Right?
Asian countries, they don't favor critical thinking. It's cramming and memorizing. It's not just it's like they focus not too much on deep critical thinking in Western nations like Britain and the US, or the Judeo-Christian values of higher order thinking. The East Asians more like hierarchical, memorize, meaningful memorize, and then memorize for different concepts like in math and science and grammar, not on critical thinking.
Yeah, and one of the things that's why I picked this particular image, because it says diversity and inclusion, right? But it seems to focus on inclusion, right? More than necessarily diversity. And one of the aspects that I find with my students, and I'm going to ask you to share some things that Harriet, I'll get with you in a minute. Welcome. Okay. One of the things that I found is like, how students have to participate in class, right? They have to many times in adult class, they're marked, even if you grade them, they're marked for participation. But a lot of my students from China, right? They didn't participate. And because the style is different. And, when you participate, right, and you automatically just jump in, they told me you're showing off. Because, you're showing off, right? And remember, I don't want stereotypes or generalizations, but if you come from certain cultures, just jumping in and expressing your opinion, it's a way of showing off. And I would get people from different schools at NYU and say, oh, my Chinese students don't talk in class, right? And I said, but if you call on them by name, they will participate, but they're just not going to jump in. So there are differences in style also, right? And how do you get them? So you were talking earlier, Robert, about giving them stems, right?
Sentence
So
stems,
I have to
model
teach,
example.
I think, would you consider, right?
They need to
Are
deliberate,
learning-
and then respond.
Learning how to paraphrase what somebody else had said, right? So I think that, giving, listening to what your students do and what they say. So,
Can I say something?
absolutely.
I taught in Chinatown. All my students were Chinese, right?
Mhm.
And what their most concern was about their children and would they fit into the culture and be successful. They didn't really care about themselves and what was happening. They cared about how can I help my child? And they went to school because they wanted to learn how to read and write so they could help their students read and write. And there's that emotionality between a parent and a child that's you can't take it away by culture or by anything.
Also,
It's
another
there.
thing is that those are adult students. They're more mature. They have families and raising kids. Like students who are international students, they don't have that type of adult responsibility. If you're raising a parent, you're going to darn well speak up and get more involved. Whereas if you're an international student in your 20s, you're not as fully as engaged to speak out. It also depends on the experience that you have. you're gonna raise your kids, you're gonna speak in English to the kids, teachers, and you're gonna be more involved and engaged, and you say, oh, this is how my kids are learning. I'm doing the same thing too. I teach a lot of Asian immigrants too, ma'am.
And Diana, you're really getting back to one of my earlier points that we said we have to know what our students need to be able to do, right? And I find, when I was working with some adults, I want to know what they're doing in the classroom. I want to know how to help them with reading, even at the same time they're improving their reading skills. So we do have to listen to what not that we don't have to follow a curriculum, because sometimes I need to follow the curriculum. And sometimes a curriculum is imposed, right? I know what I need to do, but I still think we can take time to figure out, what does our students need to do? Gary, I'm just curious, in terms of how do you address being culturally sensitive? And culture can be age, it can be gender. See, Valentina still has her hand up. I don't know.
No, it's not. I think it's new.
Oh, there's Valentina. Valentina, hi, Valentina.
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry, we had some tech issues before. So yes, I want to respond to the needs of the students. Like you said, if it's parents, for example, of the public school kids in my classes, then like, for example, when it's the season of the parent-teacher conferences, for example, We Speak New York has a whole series of like stay in school or meet the parents with a lot of like valuable vocabulary. So I include this right before the teacher-parent conferences or before like September starts. So this way I prepare my students, for these teacher conferences. So kind of like address their needs versus like, it was said before, if it's international students, for example, and I know their needs for college and career improvement. So every time, for example, it's CUNY event or some career job fair in the area. So I share this information too. So this way I try to meet both students' needs and also coming from the cultural background, like you said before, knowing like, for example, that some countries like more south, let's say, students told me that it's not culturally okay for them to talk about their plans in public. Let's say if we would be using future tenses and I ask them to make sentences like I will or I should, or like making plans like in 5 years I will be doing this, a lot of them do not feel comfortable saying this loud because they believe like cultural things that, oh, we don't have to talk about this publicly, can we just write it to you on a piece of paper? And again, like I had some students from specific countries that they have, like it was said before, authority for the teacher. So it's not like they don't want to speak up in class, or also the respect of the teachers. So if any questions, getting them to the creative activities, right? Thinking before thinking analytical. I just want to say, yes, I agree. Just because the teacher is saying this. From other backgrounds, like, they feel it's okay to like even argue with the teacher. Let's say if teacher is saying something like A, some students are okay with disagreeing with other students or the teacher and keeping the whole discussion going about that, versus the other group is just like, okay, we agree, just yes.
So that's why you would have a debate. And I've had debates in my classes. A person had one idea, another, and I said, who's on this side, who's on that side? Let's debate it and let's draw a conclusion. What do you think? And that's how you get people to do higher order thinking skills.
And that's how you
do it.
And that's how you get
right, exactly. So sometimes there's kind of conflict situations, like you said, they open up
an opportunity for a conversation with your students and an ability to say, who's on this side, who's on that side? Let's hear what you're saying. Let's make a decision. Let's the whole class make a decision, like voting in Congress,
I think that's really important. I want to get to Valentina's point. I'll get back to a point you made, Valentina, but I think sometimes as teachers, we have to stand back, right? Yes. And let our students communicate with us, right? With each other, because sometimes they're they'll take more risks.
Right, again, about getting back, right, and getting back to
I'm
that
sorry.
theory of 20-80, teacher-student participation.
Right. And, students will take more risk with their peers, right? I think that happens, right? Now, I want to get back to a point that Valentina shared. And I think, Diana, you were doing the same thing, is like, give our students resources. We don't all have to do everything in our class, right? In other words, a student will come up with a need and I say, well, have you checked this? Or maybe, she referred to, actually, we're going to have a session on We Speak NYC later today, right? It's a really good source. However, some of the students, like there are sources we need to know what are available, right? And so we need to be able to refer them to certain things, right? I think that's really important. Everything doesn't have to be done in class, but if our students, sometimes, when they feel comfortable with us, they come up with real needs. And then I have to search out sources for them because we're dealing, our students are human beings with real needs. And so I think that's a really important thing. And I'm really, Valentina, I'm glad we finally got you unmuted, because your voice is really important. And I was starting to ask Gary, how do you address diversity and at the same time trying to get everybody to be included? Any special activity you might use?
Is that directed to me?
Yeah, because I started asking you and then we finally got Valentina's voice. Do you have any special an activity or how do you address diversity at the same time you want to get everybody involved?
I suppose it's just a matter of empathy towards a specific situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's letting the teacher, really, as you mentioned, just sitting back and letting other people take control. Yeah, I don't know. It has to be organic. It's nothing you can really force with an exercise.
Right.
And sometimes it doesn't happen,
I just think that how we create opportunities that are not strictly defined is really important, right? Because I never know what topic is really going to generate and get the students' voices and what do they feel really passionate about. And
I think that you can you can elicit their voices in terms of unique traditions that they might want to share with the class, unique traditions, unique holidays, and share that. I mean, we used to do, long time ago, a day of celebration for different cultures where they would let everyone share in their culture. They would set up tables, they'd bring in their different costumes, native costumes, they'd have different foods and, things like that, where it becomes like an international unity. And, but apart from that, I mean, there are activities you can do that really do support that. However, I think one thing further, I think you have a class, you have an agenda, you solicit what they need from the students. But beyond that, there is an intuitive part of teaching. And I think you have to have an intuitive sensitivity to the needs of your students individually. And I think a lot of the teaching in the classroom should be motivated by intuitive connections with the student and that may have particular needs. For instance, as an example, I have a girl, a woman in class who is extremely timid, and she really is knowledgeable, more knowledgeable than she gives herself credit for. And so I try to understand when she is timid in her responses and activate a more positive response from her in different ways. Another one has to be right. She has to be right. And it really takes a long time to get her to be open to looking at things in a different way that may be another way of understanding something that I'm trying to communicate. What I mean to say by that is that whatever the curriculum is, I think that a teacher has to have an intuitive understanding of the students individually. That's my thought.
Well, Connie, you really captured like almost everything we're talking about here, because you talked about, giving students credit. I'm trying to paraphrase what you were saying, credit for their experience. And, culture is really important. And one of the activities that I often use is called a cultural capsule, because our students come with culture. They have knowledge, and many times they'll share something, and I can do it with reading and writing. And I meant to, I didn't know if this particular thing was going to come up today, but somebody from Argentina, they said, okay, on New Year's, you will see this in Argentina, and they created, multiple choice options, and everybody in class had to figure out what was the right answer. And then they got to talk about it, because most people have knowledge of the culture, and not everybody, but most people are proud of their culture. And, so we need to bring in culture. I think that's really important. And it may be different, but that doesn't mean it's wrong, right? And being able to share, and how do you activate their voices? So that's really important.
I think the other
sorry.
important step is to acknowledge their cultures, but to let them know what the culture they're in now is and how to survive it. And to say, yes, that's great, that's wonderful, but right now you're here in New York City, and this is how you need your kid to go to school, how you need to get your GED, how you need to do this. And we acknowledge and we admire who you are, but we are also giving you the opportunity to understand how you could overcome barriers here so that you could survive
And Valentina, you had something you wanted to say. I'll get back to that in a minute. Go ahead, Valentina.
Right. So I just wanted to follow up, right, what the speaker before me said, that basically I just followed the KWL, like I always start with my students what they already know. So like you said, I mentioned their culture, their background into the picture, and what everyone is more willing to talk about is something about them, especially culture, traditions like holidays and food. And I think, Mary, you were the one who a few years ago taught some workshop or presentation about teaching about the food. Was it you?
I don't think so.
No, but maybe I'm confused.
I like to eat, but
yeah. So there, I remember one of the conference I attended, and I always bring this book, great book by the New York McCourt, Teacher Man. And I always remember this activity that he had students cook their food and write about their food, like recipes. And he brought the students to the park where they put like a picnic on the benches, and the passerbys, like total strangers, were walking by, and students were telling about their cultural food and sharing the recipes, not only with the classmates, but with other people. So I would say that topic of food and holidays, these are the best topics to open up students and create this community of learners. And even students who are not willing to speak in class, not willing to write, these are the topics that will crack anyone from any culture, from any background. And like a speaker before me mentioned, that yes, we want them to know about American ways of, culture or traditions or holidays or education, but coming from students' background, right? Them telling us how it is in their country, and then bringing them, okay, so now we can't discriminate, right? We can't say this is bad, or your country way is bad, or your cultural way is bad, because we didn't know why. But now that we know the students' background, and they all are proud of their past and cultures and traditions and religions, but now that we shared, okay, but here is American way. And this way they accept it better, other than different, right? So they oppose it less, not only American way, but also other cultures, because they're now more open and more educated. And a lot of times, a lot of students don't want to take some, opinions or views, because they don't understand the background behind some students' ways or opinions.
And I'll get to Susan in a minute. One of the things that I find is when my students ask me things, I have to go out and observe, right? You know, I went to my local post office and said, you know, I was reading about how you operate in a post office, but that's not how people communicate in my post office, right? So I think we as teachers have to also listen. Susan, welcome. I guess, Susan, you had a comment.
Yeah, one of the things is too, is like, what is actually the American way? Because I'm from the Midwest, and when
Mhm.
I came to New York, for me, it was like going to a different country.
Absolutely.
I had to learn like the language here that I didn't understand. Like, oh, it was hot, so we sat out on the stoop. I didn't know what stoop for me means to bend
Right.
over. And I stood home all weekend. You didn't sit down at all?
Right.
So that it's a mixture of everything. And that's why I say the real American culture is myriad of different cultures. It's not just one.
Because when I moved from the East Coast to the West Coast, and someone said, "Are you sleeping in?" I go, "What is sleeping in?" I had never heard that expression. I had always used sleeping late, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the things is I wanted to use this as my last slide, is sometimes I'll put, I used to put posters up in my classroom, right? And one of them was, now, if I put this one, your voice matters, they might not know what voice means, right? Think about it. We know voice because they think voice is how you sound, right? So sometimes
but what you
sorry.
have to understand, and what Susan
Wait,
said,
hold on.
is that the American culture is diverse because
Mhm.
it came from different countries
Right.
and different people. And that's the same way our students are. They're diverse as well. So it's
Right.
not like we have this magnitude of this is what we are. We just have a confluence of ideas. And if you're the West, the Northwest, the South, the Southeast, whatever, it's the same way that our students are. They come from different places. We all have to understand each other and work together in a commonality of unity. That's what it is.
Right. And also
Okay, can I advocate for Robert, please? He's had his arm up for a long
Yeah,
time.
I haven't
also-
seen
Stand
Robert's.
up.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Thank you,
also,
Gary.
What about, have you done a lot of research about a culturally responsive teaching where you validate, affirm, build and bridge the assets and funds of knowledge that students bring instead of using a so-called white middle-class culture?
Right. And we have to be very, because culture, there's so many varieties. You know, it could be the Midwest to New York. It could be Portugal and France. It also could be, if I'm working with business people, they have a different culture than necessarily people that are going into teaching, right? So, you know, I think we have to think of culture as being broader. And, you know, so I would have changed this to your ideas matter, right? If this were, because I actually put signs up in my classroom, your ideas matter. And I just want to thank you for making this an interactive workshop, because your ideas do matter. And I appreciate, and I hope you keep in contact with me.
Yeah. Have you done social emotional learning? Have you done research about social emotional learning, Mary? From workshops and your own personal research about that stuff?
Yeah, but you know, I think that's a different sort of like, because sometimes there's specific strategies or suggestions, right?
Mhm.
Right. And because, you know, language or knowledge is socially constructed,
Mhm.
you know, so we have to think about that. So thank you for all for sharing. I think, Gary, we're almost done,
Just one
right?
point. I
Sure.
just posted the evaluation form.
Okay.
So be sure you fill that out, especially if you're going to ask for a certificate of attendance. We need that.
No, Gary, I just came in late. I didn't, because I registered a few days ago. I didn't meet the deadline. Do I still get a certificate, sir?
Yes. Yes,
Sure.
there's no problem with that.
Oh, I see.
No, just make sure you fill out the evaluation form.
And will I have Ms. Carpenter's PowerPoint as well?
You'll be sent within a couple of days, you'll be sent kind of like a postmortem, a wrap up, and you'll be given the
excellent.
link to all the information that was presented. So you'll be able to download that.
So where's
you
the
know-
evaluation form, Gary?
Where is it?
Yeah.
It's in the chat.
Oh,
Look,
okay.
look at the chat.
Gary,
and There's a link.
the class
I didn't know where it was.
wasn't showing up.
That's
It
right.
should be right there.
Let me look.
Not here.
But thank you all. I learned from your voices.
Mary, thank you very much.
And Mary, thank you.
Good
Connie, take
chat.
care, my
Thank
friend.
you, Mary.
That Connie's over there?
Yeah,
Connie,
she was.
I'm Robert Kim. So I hope to meet you one day face to face, my friend. You have a lot
I
to-
hope to meet all of you face to face. I
Yeah.
hope, I think the
I've met
conference is
some of
going
you
to be in
face-to-face
person
before.
next year, and I think that would make it really good.
Oh,
And
It's
if you
so much
guys,
better in person. Believe me,
what? I'm sorry, I am
it's
interrupting.
so much better in person,
Mhm. Darn right.
face to face, faccia, face to face.
But at least you made it interactive, and I think that's really important when you do Zoom. And I learned from you. And if maybe we can all continue this conversation and share some ideas.
We have your email, Mary.
My email's on the top of the presentation, right?
As I remember, you remembered me from that Columbia University webinar.
Okay.
And I-
See, when you share ideas, I remember my students more, right? I think we.
remember you- and
Okay, so I
also-
guess I'll be signing out and.
And as just as a reminder, you'll all be getting this, the recording is going to be redacted so that it's a lot cleaner. And you'll be getting a Google page. So you'll be able to see this again. Also, every link that was sent on the chat will also be put up.
Groovy.
And Charlene, hi, I see your. All right, so guys, I hope to see you in the plenary. They're actually going to be using We Speak New York, which Susan had referred to.